The calm before the storm. It was a quiet weekend afternoon at Brightway Market in Denver, Colorado. The familiar hum of small-town life filled the air, children laughing as they begged their parents for candy, the soft chatter of shoppers browsing the aisles, and the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels. Among the crowd, Elizabeth Carter, a retired colonel, moved with quiet composure. Dressed in a simple white shirt and blue jeans, she blended seamlessly into the scene, her military past masked by her humble appearance. But beneath her unassuming demeanor lay the steel resolve of someone who had commanded soldiers on the battlefield and faced challenges that most couldn't fathom. As Elizabeth picked up a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, she savored the rare moment of peace. These small errands grounded her, reminding her of the simple joys of life. But her tranquility was short-lived. At the end of the aisle, a tall man in a crisp police uniform, Officer Michael Hayes, casually knocked a packet of noodles and a bottle of soda off a shelf. The items tumbled to the floor, scattering across the tiles. Elizabeth paused, expecting him to pick them up. Instead, Michael glanced at the mess with an air of indifference and walked away, his polished boots clicking against the floor. Elizabeth frowned. Her years in the military had instilled in her a deep sense of accountability, a belief that even the smallest actions mattered. Michael's blatant disregard for his actions struck a nerve. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her words cutting through the hum of the market. "You dropped a few things. Perhaps you should pick them up so others won't be inconvenienced." Michael turned, his piercing gaze sweeping over her as if she were a mere annoyance. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Who do you think you are to tell me what to do?" he sneered. "I've got more important things to worry about than cleaning up noodles." The shoppers around them paused, their curiosity piqued. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "As a police officer," she replied evenly, "you have a responsibility to set an example for the community. Picking up after yourself isn't just polite, it shows respect for others." Michael's smirk widened, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You seem to think you know a lot about responsibility, but let me give you some advice. Stick to your own business. This is a trivial matter." The atmosphere in the aisle grew tense. Shoppers exchanged uneasy glances, some pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Elizabeth could feel their curious gazes on her, but she stood her ground, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. Years of commanding troops had taught her that composure was a weapon in its own right. "Sir," she said, her voice taking on the measured authority of a seasoned leader, "this isn't just about the mess you left behind. It's about the uniform you're wearing. Right now, everyone is watching you, and your behavior reflects not only on you but on the profession you represent." Michael's eyes flashed with irritation. He laughed a hollow, mocking sound that echoed down the aisle. "You really think this is about my uniform?" he said, his voice rising. "You're just a nobody trying to lecture me about responsibility. Save it." Elizabeth's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. His arrogance wasn't just an insult to her, it was an affront to the values she had spent her life defending. She took a step forward, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of her convictions. "You can dismiss me all you want," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "But remember, the way you act now will follow you. It will define how people see you not just today, but every day after." The crowd grew quieter, their attention fully captured by the confrontation. Michael, feeling cornered, crossed his arms and sneered. "You think your words mean anything to me? I have the badge, the power. You're just an ordinary woman trying to make a scene." Elizabeth's expression didn't waver. She knew his words were meant to provoke her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Power doesn't give you the right to abuse it," she said firmly, "and it certainly doesn't exempt you from accountability." The tension in the aisle was palpable. Shoppers whispered among themselves, their phones capturing every moment. Michael's confidence faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with a bark of laughter. "You want accountability? Go ahead and report me. See if it changes anything." Elizabeth met his gaze, her eyes calm yet unyielding. "I intend to," she said. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. Her movements were deliberate, her resolve unshaken. "I'd like to report an officer abusing his power," she said into the phone, her voice steady. "Brightway Market, aisle 6. We need immediate assistance." Michael's smug expression melted into shock. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in anger. Elizabeth lowered her phone, meeting his glare without flinching. "Doing what you should have done," she replied, "defending fairness and responsibility." Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the tense silence. The crowd parted as police officers entered the store, their presence adding a weight of authority to the scene. Behind them, Mayor Jonathan Moore strode in, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. The mayor's voice cut through the hum of whispers. "Colonel Carter," he said, his tone respectful, "are you all right?" Elizabeth nodded, her composure intact. "I'm fine, but this behavior needs to be addressed." Jonathan turned to Michael, his expression darkening. "Officer Hayes, you've disgraced your uniform and your badge. This will not be tolerated." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jonathan ordered Michael's immediate suspension. Elizabeth stood tall, her heart pounding, but her face calm. She knew this was just the beginning of a larger fight, a fight not just for her dignity, but for justice and accountability. What do you think about Elizabeth's actions? Have you ever witnessed or stood up against injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The once bustling Brightway Market now stood still, as if time itself had paused. The crowd remained frozen in place, their eyes darting between Elizabeth Carter and Officer Michael Hayes, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Phones captured every second, and hushed whispers rippled like waves. Michael's earlier arrogance had all but vanished. His face was flushed, his composure cracking under the weight of the stares and the looming authority of Mayor Jonathan Moore. He tried to speak, but his words faltered under the mayor's piercing gaze. "This is a misunderstanding," Michael stammered, his voice weak and unconvincing. "She's blowing this out of proportion. It's not what it looks like." Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Enough. Your actions speak louder than your excuses, Officer Hayes." As the words hung in the air, Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on Michael, her calm demeanor hiding the storm of emotions beneath. She wasn't just angry at his behavior, she was heartbroken. Heartbroken that someone in a position of trust could abuse their power so blatantly. Heartbroken because she had seen this too many times before, both on the battlefield and at home. "Officer Hayes," Jonathan continued, his tone steely, "you've not only disrespected this community, but also the badge you wear. A badge meant to protect and serve, not intimidate." Michael clenched his fists, his pride wounded, but he said nothing. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice steady, but filled with quiet resolve. "This isn't just about one incident, Mr. Mayor," she said, addressing Jonathan directly. "This is about accountability. If people in positions of power think they're above the rules, then what hope do the rest of us have?" Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others murmured softly. The weight of her message was undeniable. Elizabeth turned to the onlookers, her voice rising slightly. "We all have a responsibility to stand up when we see injustice. Ignoring it only allows it to grow. This isn't just about me or him, it's about the kind of community we want to live in." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their initial hesitation giving way to agreement. A woman stepped forward, her phone still in hand. "She's right," the woman said. "I've seen him act this way before, pushing people around like he owns the place. It's about time someone stood up to him." Others chimed in, sharing their stories of Michael's arrogance and abuse of power. Elizabeth's heart ached with every word. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were a pattern, a symptom of something much larger. Jonathan's expression darkened as he listened. He turned back to Michael, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your actions don't just reflect on you, Officer Hayes. They tarnish the trust we've worked so hard to build between law enforcement and this community. Trust that people like Colonel Carter have fought to protect." Michael opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Elizabeth's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you even understand the weight of that uniform?" she asked, her tone sharp but not raised. "The trust it represents? The sacrifices others have made to protect that trust?" For a moment, Michael looked at her, and something in his eyes flickered, perhaps shame, perhaps regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of defiance. "You think you can lecture me?" he spat. "You think you're better than me because you were in the military? Let me tell you something, power is power, and people like me will always have it." Elizabeth didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a quiet intensity that made the entire room lean in to hear. "Power is meaningless without integrity," she said, "and those who abuse it don't deserve it." The crowd erupted in applause, their collective support washing over Elizabeth like a wave. For the first time, She allowed herself a small smile, not of victory, but of relief. Relief that her words were reaching not just Michael, but everyone watching. As the police officers moved to escort Michael out, Jonathan turned to the crowd. "I promise you this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. "We will investigate this incident thoroughly, and Officer Hayes will be held accountable for his actions. No one is above the law." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's all we've ever wanted, justice, not revenge." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet, but filled with respect. "You've done more than most would dare to, Colonel Carter. You've reminded us all of what true leadership looks like." The supermarket's tension began to ease as the crowd dispersed, though many lingered to shake Elizabeth's hand or thank her. A young boy approached, clutching his mother's hand tightly. "You're a hero," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth knelt to his level, a gentle smile gracing her face. "No," she said softly. "I'm just someone who did what was right. And you can do that too, no matter how small the act." The boy beamed, and Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. Moments like this made the fight worth it. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting the parking lot in hues of gold and crimson. Elizabeth stood with Jonathan as they watched Michael's patrol car disappear down the road, flanked by police escorts. Jonathan broke the silence. "This isn't the end, you know. People like him don't change easily." Elizabeth nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but it's a start, and sometimes that's all we need." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from a fellow veteran, congratulating her for standing up. She tucked the phone away, a sense of quiet determination settling over her. What would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for what's right felt impossible? Let us know in the comments below. The video of Elizabeth Carter's confrontation with Officer Michael Hayes at Brightway Market continued to dominate headlines and social media. While many hailed Elizabeth as a hero, others criticized her for challenging authority. The polarizing attention only deepened her determination to address the deeper, systemic issues exposed by the incident. This wasn't just about one officer's arrogance. It was about a culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Elizabeth sat in a small sunlit room at City Hall, surrounded by members of the community and local leaders. The air buzzed with tension as voices rose and fell in debate. Some supported Elizabeth's push for reform, while others argued that her actions had painted law enforcement in an unfair light. "Colonel Carter," one man said sharply, his voice cutting through the hum of the room, "don't you think your public stance has done more harm than good? Police morale is at an all-time low because of incidents like this being blown out of proportion." Elizabeth met his gaze with unwavering calm. "With all due respect," she replied, her voice steady, "morale shouldn't depend on hiding the truth. Accountability isn't an attack, it's an opportunity to rebuild trust." Mayor Jonathan Moore nodded in agreement, his hands clasped on the table. "Colonel Carter's point stands," he said. "If we want our community to trust us, we need to show them we're willing to hold ourselves to the same standards we expect of them." The room fell silent as Jonathan's words sank in. Elizabeth took the opportunity to press her point. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," she said, her tone softening slightly. "It's about lifting us all up. When people see that we're willing to confront our flaws, they're more likely to believe in us." Despite her measured words, Elizabeth couldn't ignore the growing hostility from certain corners. Protesters had begun gathering outside City Hall, accusing her of betraying the very ideals she claimed to uphold. Some even went as far as to send her threats, their messages laced with vitriol and malice. One evening, as she sat in her modest living room, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news clip showing a small but vocal group of protesters chanting her name outside City Hall, holding signs that read, "Traitor," and "Support the Blue." Elizabeth stared at the screen, her chest tightening. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Was she doing the right thing? Was her fight for justice worth the personal cost? But then she glanced at her dining table where a stack of letters from supporters sat. One letter in particular stood out, a handwritten note from a young woman named Claire, who shared her own story of standing up to abuse of power. "You gave me courage," the letter read. "Because of you, I know my voice matters." Elizabeth placed the letter back on the table, her resolve hardening. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about people like Claire, people who needed someone to show them that standing up for what's right wasn't just possible, but necessary. The next day, Elizabeth attended a community town hall meeting where tensions were at their peak. Police officers, community leaders, and concerned citizens filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and skepticism. Elizabeth stood at the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their fears, their doubts. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Many of you know me as the woman who stood up to Officer Hayes at Brightway Market," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't about one officer, one incident, or even one city. This is about the kind of community we want to build together." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she continued. "Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a foundation. Without it, trust crumbles. And trust is what binds us, what allows us to feel safe and protected. But trust isn't given freely, it's earned. And it's time we earn it back." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, their arms crossed defensively. "Colonel Carter," a woman in the front row said, her voice trembling slightly, "I admire your courage, but do you really think we can change a system that's been broken for so long?" Elizabeth's gaze softened as she addressed the question. "Change isn't easy," she admitted, "and it doesn't happen overnight. But every step forward matters. Every voice raised against injustice matters. And when we stand together, we can achieve more than we ever thought possible." The room erupted in applause, though not everyone joined in. Elizabeth knew there were still many who doubted her, who resisted the changes she was advocating for. But she also knew that change often began with discomfort. As the meeting ended, Jonathan approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You're making waves, Colonel Carter," he said, "but waves don't always break the way we want them to." Elizabeth smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "The important thing is that they break," she replied. "We just have to keep pushing." The days following the heated town hall were a whirlwind for Elizabeth Carter. The reforms she advocated for began to take root, but the resistance was stronger than ever. Protests outside City Hall grew louder, fueled by misinformation and fear of change. Elizabeth, however, refused to back down. She knew that the hardest battles were often the most important ones. One morning, Elizabeth sat in her small kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the window as she read a news article on her phone. The headline read, "Colonel Carter sparks national conversation on police accountability." Below it was a photo of her standing at the podium during the town hall meeting, her expression resolute. She set the phone down, her gaze drifting to the stack of letters on the table. Among them was a handwritten note from Mayor Jonathan Moore, thanking her for her unwavering dedication. "Your leadership," the letter read, "has reminded us all of what true integrity looks like." Elizabeth smiled faintly, but the weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had ignited a spark, but it was up to others to keep the flame alive. That evening, Elizabeth attended a ceremony at Brightway Market, where a small plaque was unveiled in her honor. The inscription read, "In recognition of courage, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of justice." The crowd applauded as Jonathan Moore stepped forward to speak. "Colonel Carter's actions remind us that one person can make a difference," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "She didn't just challenge an officer's misconduct, she challenged all of us to be better, to do better." When Elizabeth took the microphone, her voice was steady, though her heart was heavy with emotion. "This plaque isn't just for me," she said. "It's for everyone who's ever stood up for what's right, even when it was difficult. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in building a just society." Despite the positive momentum, Elizabeth knew the fight was far from over. The case against Michael Hayes went to trial, and the courtroom became a battleground for two opposing narratives. On one side, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his abuse of power, supported by testimonies from Elizabeth and others who had witnessed his misconduct. On the other, his defense painted him as a scapegoat, a victim of political agendas and media sensationalism. Elizabeth sat in the courtroom every day, her presence a silent testament to her commitment to justice. When the verdict finally came, the tension was unbearable. The judge's voice echoed in the silent room, guilty on all counts. The relief that swept through Elizabeth was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of the journey remained. Hayes's sentencing marked the end of one chapter, but Elizabeth knew there were countless others like him who had yet to be held accountable. As the weeks turned into months, The reforms Elizabeth had fought for began to bear fruit. The mandatory training programs she proposed were implemented, focusing on ethics and community engagement. An anonymous reporting system for misconduct was introduced, giving people a safe way to voice their concerns. Slowly but surely, trust between the police and the community began to rebuild. Elizabeth's story continued to resonate far beyond Denver. She was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and community events across the country. Her message was simple but powerful. Justice isn't just a concept, it's a choice, and it's one we must make every day. One evening, as she walked through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, a young girl approached her. "Are you Colonel Carter?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "I am. What's your name?" "Amelia," the girl replied, clutching a small notebook. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion. "You already are brave, Amelia," she said gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when it's hard." Back at home, Elizabeth sat at her desk, her hands resting on a blank page of her journal. She thought about everything: the confrontation at Brightway Market, the trial, the reforms, and the countless lives she had touched along the way. Picking up her pen, she wrote, "Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing firm when the world feels like it's against you. It's about choosing to fight for what's right, no matter how difficult the path. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: as long as there's injustice, there will always be those willing to stand against it, and I will always be one of them." As she closed the journal, a sense of peace washed over her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. Because true change isn't about one person, it's about all of us. Have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it was hard? Share your story in the comments, and remember, together we can make a difference. The end.